Beginning, I would like to get the chance to place rental control in the bigger question of urban building stock within the broader perspective of social challenges per se. And a recurring theme of my presentation will be the topic of knowledge and evidence and data. Data as evidence for fair rent control, for consistent and evidence-based policymaking and reform. And in German, also considering that informal, hard to measure tenant-landlord negotiations are central to the Mietpreisbremse. And also allow me now to first give you a bit of background on the German situation of land taken in general and the environmental aspects of housing. Because housing is at the center of biodiversity and climate challenges. And as you can see on the left upper side, there is red is the increase of land use per person due to living space increase, and the blue and yellow is the increase of vacant areas. And what you can see is that the German unification has left its marks, and you still see the blue areas in East Germany. Then you see an overall increase of per person land uptake in residential areas. So while we increased basically housing with construction, the increase in living space per person rose much more. On the right side, we try to cluster different phenomena of high land use per person. We took the 30% of people living on highest land use per person and showed that there are different phenomena that need to be tackled differently. For example, there's rich suburbia with, for example, empty net effects, meaning that land is underused. Then towards the vacancies, or blue is older and poorer villages. And these high land use and high increase of land consumption pose difficulties and problems for climate adaptation, for biodiversity, for climate mitigation. And we have not only the affordability target, but also the target to reach, for example, the EU natural restoration targets, which means maintaining parks and green spaces. We have a 30-hectare land consumption target, which means land construction and land consumption. And we need to make ourselves, or we need to adapt and prepare for heat islands, flood risks, and increasing infrastructure costs due to climate change. So what I want to show is that we need a lot of investment in urban infrastructure, but what we don't need investment in is a business model to sell out unrefurbished old urban building stock and make it more expensive than it needs to be. And high rents in cities have another problem. They can increase urban sprawl, inability of tenants with old contracts, speculative vacancies, and again, high per person space use. So you see, rent control is really at the center of a wider problem of challenges in the poly crisis. And urban building stock is also the most efficient and sustainable one. So this is really something we have there. And now I want to go to the rent rate, the regulation that actually could make rents affordable in Germany. And I think what you see on the first gauge is the German rent rate is, the Mietpreisbremse is complicated. I really love that. And we needed to become lawyers ourselves. I'm a social and cultural anthropologist. I work with data scientists, and basically I needed to become a lawyer to understand. So the short design of the Mietpreisbremse, the rent can be reduced if more than 10%. The rent is more than 10% above the comparative rent. The scope is only in certain cities with tense housing market, and a certain city before 2014. It's based on the qualified rent index, and the initiator has to be the tenant. So they complain informally, or they sue the landlord. And there are many exclusions which make it very complicated for both sides. It makes it complicated for tenants because they don't know if I sue my landlord, will I be successful? So this is huge. This is a huge risk, especially for tenants. And then on the other side, it's also unclear for the landlords because they don't know what are the exemptions. Am I now the rent break or not? So in short, problems are the responsibilization of tenants, a complex process, unclear information access for all sides, and rare evidence on successful rent reduction because of the informal tenant-landlord negotiations. And regarding the information access, I have to say one thing: the rent index and how it is assessed is actually good, and I think it is complicated, but if we would do something with that, if we use that as starting point, it's not that bad. The problem is 68 questions for assessing the comparative rent index. There are a lot of qualitative questions. That's great. We used 28 questions in our survey to compare the rent of the participants of the survey with the comparative rent index. And you can imagine no one of our participants answered all the questions because it's too complicated to know the building age, the quality of the floor, and like other questions. But anyway, let's go on. So currently the rent break is discussed again because of the planned exemption. And these are a few like quotes from the media, and I really like one that says rent break only if you fight for it. I think that's nice, and that's actually true. So how now did we try to investigate the efficacy of the rent break? So we draw a sample of 10,000 citizens in Munich, sent them a postal invitation to an online survey, and had 356 participants. Unfortunately, that's not a high number, and from April 24 to June 20. We also collaborated with Kantar, which also creates the average rent index. So what did we ask? We asked about the knowledge about the rent break. Do you know the rent applicable in Munich? Then also experiences, like if the tenant knew about it, did they try to calculate the rent index? Did they do something if they found out that they are 10% above, more than 10% above the rent index, and so on? Then we had questions to estimate the average rent. I already told you, 28 questions. And then contract and rent information to find out if there are exclusions and so on, and what the difference is between the actual rent and the average compatible rent. Then we asked them some social questions about their experiences on the housing market, their landlord behavior, to find out like how they are treated, how they might like be anxious about, for example, acting and doing something. And we asked them demographic questions: income, age, household size, mother tongue, and so on, and attitude towards political measures in the rent break. And first, the first result was that actually quite some tenants could pull the rent break, as we say in German, and of course there like a large bar where we can not really say this may be, and the clear and the certainty bar that is due to the imputed unused. But it's 24% who certainly could pull the rent break. And then another finding was that the rent break actually in its design is a kind of like set of barriers. And with every barrier, we lose tenants who like take action. So the first barrier was to calculate the comparative rent. Many did not do that, and I can tell you, I have a PhD. It took me 1 year to finalize that. Find out I paid too much rent and reduce it. Then the rent, of course, you find out I'm more than 10% above, and some did not like fall under this criteria. But then the next question was, did they send a complaint to the landlord? And a lot of people did not do that. And it's really interesting that a lack of knowledge about the rent break itself. Sorry, I forgot that. So the majority of people didn't know that the rent break actually exists in Munich. And the anxiety of pulling the rent break were the hardest areas. But let's look at vulnerability, because actually we want affordable housing, right? So we want actually especially vulnerable people to find housing, to reduce their rent. But they, what we find out is that they more often live in deficiently conditioned apartments, and they also live more often in apartments that pay certainly 10% above the local comparative index. So they really make a bad deal. But we didn't find out, unfortunately, if they are able to pull their rent break more often. We just found that they are less likely to calculate the comparative rent index. Then about landlord types, what we saw is that the apartments with the worst conditions were owned by public institutions than by private, and companies are rather small on this scale. And then next, it was mostly the private owners who had a rent above the 10% comparative rent index. So and then yeah, that's it. So you can also see that the deficiently conditioned apartments were the ones that are more often above the rent break. So basically, old unfurbished apartments, nobody cared for, often in the hands of private owners, are the ones that should be subject to the rent break, but they aren't because the rent break is insufficient. And then we asked them about their political preferences, and I don't want to go through all these aspects, but what is interesting is that the majority wants government action, and so there's a huge demand for political action, and it seems that the rent control is not considered as the action that is demanded. So I think there's potential in the rent break. It could, for example, reorient investment, because currently investing in unfurbished apartments and then increase the rents is a business deal that's not stopped. And I think we wonder if the reason that private owners can ask for so much more rent is because they have the potential threat of terminating the rent contract for own use. The public and corporate owners can do. So they interestingly stayed a little above the 10%, but not more. And maybe this is a risk reduction strategy. But anyway, so this investment could go into new construction. It could also incentivize renovation and refurbishment of buildings if the rent break would be targeted. So that, for example, the qualitative rent index that incentivizes energy efficient refurbishments, for example. There are studies going on about this topic, and rent could be lower for lower income groups, but the German rent break has a limited effect, which also show also shown by other studies. And I was really quick because I'm also almost finished. But take your time. So one key takeaway I want to highlight is that we need building information. We need information for tenants, for the efficient application of the rent break, but also for consistent and evidence-based policy making. And to come back to the other challenges we have, I think that right now Germany is really behind in collecting data on their real estate and rent situations. So the rent index is like a good start. I don't know, because we've had it in the morning. So for example, in Munich alone, there were 2,000 apartments and that were tested with a survey with a lot of questions to understand the quality of the apartment. And this is pretty good. But now for every tenant wants to test and to compare their own rent to the rent of the comparative index, they have to basically gather all the information that is needed, and they don't have access to the survey information. So if you imagine that in 5 years, 30% of the population in Munich are moving. So 30% of the population in Munich have to run around, find out about the age of the building, the quality, is the roof renovated, the quality of the floor, is there heated water in bath or kitchen, and all of these questions. So this is difficult, and I think that first having better information access for the tenants would help. We also have to talk about the question if it's really the best way to responsibilize the tenants, and not rather do that via municipalities or other institutions. Then secondly, also municipalities and the state, you currently don't have a lot of informed decisions. So this small study is really just the first step, but I think there should be more coming. And so I want to ask and to invite a discussion on the question of how to create better evidence on the effects of the rent control, and how we can make information accessible for tenants and administrations. And we should really make the tenants responsible for cooling down markets, although we know that they are actually on the lowest end of the ladder. And that's it already. So I'm happy because now we can have more discussion.
Oh, yeah.